So good morning to all of you who are tuned in to the third day of our summer seminar on the heart. It's wonderful to see your messages coming in, your greetings from all over the world, and we're just delighted to be with you and to use this virtual seminar in an effort to break down those long distances that are between us as we come together to explore and such a fitting theme when we're thinking about trying to break down those long distances, namely the theme of the heart. This morning we have our first panel will be devoted to the theme of the heart and the emotions, to the emotions in the moral life. And we'll be hearing from Mark Spencer, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, and a fellow with the Hildebrand Project, and also from Beth Rath, who is an Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the Borromeo Seminary in Ohio. So with that, I will turn it over to you, and we'll do as we've been doing. We'll hear from the two of you, and then we'll go to questions. So I invite all of you who have questions, please submit them in the Q&A function. So.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks so much, John Henry, for the introduction to this panel. So, you know, I was thinking there's this common wisdom, if you can even call it wisdom, that you can't help how you feel, that what you do is, you know, what you do with those feelings is what really matters. What I think is implied here is that your feelings or your emotions are just morally neutral. They are outside of the scope of our control, they're outside of the scope of our will, and that only actions have moral worth. But I'm wondering, is that really the truth of the matter? Then on we have thinkers throughout the history of philosophy, like the Stoics, for example, who argue that the emotions are bad. In short, they would say something like emotions are always and everywhere opposed to reason, and that it's this unfortunate condition of the human person that we've got this disease called the emotions that should be basically eradicated. Is that the truth of the matter? So we have some questions here. You know, are emotions always bad? Are they spoiling acts that would otherwise be morally good? Or might emotions be morally neutral? Could there be good emotions? How about bad emotions? Could we be responsible for how we feel? And even, I wonder, might we be responsible for the lack of emotion that we might be experiencing? So Thomas Aquinas and Dietrich von Hildebrand have some answers or thoughts about these Aquinas' position, and then Mark will come in after me and talk about Hildebrand's view. And my hope is that we'll come to the truth of the matter, or begin to come to the truth of the matter about some of these questions, and maybe discover some points of convergence and divergence between Hildebrand and Aquinas on these questions. So I like starting out with definitions, and that's what I'm going to do first. The title of the panel is Emotions and the Moral Life. And what do we mean when we're talking about the moral life? Well, I think, so in my view, or in Thomas's view, I think we're talking about human life in terms of its end, in terms of its goal. Now, what is the end of human life? Well, for Aquinas, it's going to be happiness. Happiness for humans involves the perfection of the whole person. And that includes the perfection of all of our basic powers. So the perfection of the intellect, all right? So we'll be satisfied in our knowledge, in possession of the truth. We'll be perfected in our will. So we will come to rest in the good. But also, one of our powers is the sensory appetite, which I talked about a couple days ago. And this sensory appetite has movements that we call the passions or the emotions. And our happiness is going to involve the perfection of that power as well. Perfection of our emotions. So in Thomas's view, both our actions and our passions contribute to happiness, to the perfection of a human life. And one question that I want to address in our conversation today is, whether or not the emotions themselves can take on the moral quality of good or evil, even apart from the actions that we do in response to those emotions. So the main focus that I'm going to take up first is just whether or not emotions can be good or bad. Thomas has something to say about this question directly in his masterwork, the Summa Theologiae, the Prima Secundae Pars, question 24, which if you have the reading packet, I put it in there. And in response to this question about whether the emotions are good or bad, Thomas doesn't give us a simple yes or no answer as we might like him to do. So the first thing he says that, well, considered just in themselves as movements of the sensory appetite, which of course we have in common with other animals, there's no moral good or evil in the emotions. So yes, considered in this way as common with other animals, yes, the emotions are morally neutral. They're neither good nor bad. But obviously, we know that animals are not praised or blamed for the feelings that they might have. But we have to consider, says Thomas, the fact that we are humans, that we are rational creatures, which means that we have to consider the emotions as being, as he says, subject to the command of reason and will. And considered in this way, the emotions then are not morally neutral. We might attribute moral good and evil to them. But to understand the ways in which we can attribute moral good and evil to them, and maybe even the ways in which emotions can make our actions morally better or worse, I want to take us into a somewhat of a deeper dive into Aquinas this morning. I want to look now at the ways in which emotions sometimes are or are not within the realm of our control, within the realm of control of the intellect and the will. And the general idea here is that if we cannot be in control of them, then they're not properly a matter for moral good or evil. They're just outside of the scope of our moral responsibility. They'd be outside of the scope then of the moral life. But if they are within our control, either directly or indirectly within our control, then they do have something to do with the moral life and the moral good and evil. Okay, so Aquinas is going to make some distinctions within our emotions. So he says that we have emotions that occur prior to the judgment of our intellect and the decision of our will. And sometimes we have emotions that occur after the judgment of our intellect or the choice of our will. We call antecedent passions or emotions those that arise in us before the judgment of our intellect or choice of our will. And the question is, could we be responsible for antecedent emotions? And once again, Aquinas isn't going to give us an easy answer to this. And what I want to do now is look at a few different types of cases with some concrete examples in order to give us the nuanced reply that Aquinas offers. So first, let's consider some cases or a case here in which the emotions are absolutely independent of the judgment of our reason. And I think these cases are kind of rare. We just have an emotion that arises in us absolutely independently of the judgment of our intellect or the choice of our will, whether it's an indirect or direct choice. So for example, out of the blue, you just feel fearful. You're simply not morally responsible for that emotion, at least at first. Now, what you do with that, whether you indulge in that emotion, whether you rebuke that emotion, then it becomes a matter for the will, and then it takes on a moral bearing for good or for evil, depending on what the emotion is, what the value or object is in which the emotion is a response. Okay, so that's the first kind of case. We have a second kind of case of antecedent passions, which are indirectly in our control. So for example, let's suppose that you are out on the town for a night with your friends and you are drinking alcohol. But what you know about yourself is that alcohol makes you very, very angry. Now you're intoxicated. Now you can feel the anger arising in you. Is that anger morally bad? Are you responsible for it? What if you become violent as a result of that anger? Would that make that act of violence morally worse? Now, one thing that we can say is true, is that the anger that's arising in you is not directly under your control. Okay, it just arose in you. But here's another thing that's true. You could have prevented that anger from arising. How? Well, by not drinking, because you knew that drinking alcohol causes this emotion to arise very strongly in you. So in this case, I think we can say you are responsible for your anger, and it could make your actions morally worse. A third type of case regarding the antecedent passions. So related to the case I just gave, are antecedent emotions that arise in you not because of some action that you are presently engaged in, like in the case of drinking alcohol, but because of the character that you have. You know, and you get your character by means of repeated actions. So you have certain emotions because of the character that you have. So let's say that you are a person with a bad character. You are vicious. Now, let's suppose certain emotions arise in you because of your vicious character. For instance, let's suppose that you feel a desire for sexual relations with someone else's wife. So you habitually feel disordered sexual desires for women who are not your wife, and you commit adultery all the time. You're a serial adulterer. Now, these emotions, this disordered desire that you feel, is bad, and I think it could make your adulterous actions worse, at least in one sense, because this emotion that you feel reveals a deep-seated vice. It reveals something about your character. So instead of being repulsed by the prospect of adultery, you actually relish it, you rejoice in it, you delight in it, you delight in the act. Okay, so much for the antecedent passions. Aquinas would also say that we have consequent passions. These are emotions that occur consequent to or after the judgment of the intellect or choice of the will. And so what I want to think about is, well, could these emotions be good or bad, and might we be responsible for these ones? And once again, there are a couple different types of cases that we consider. So first, let's think about passions that are directly under our control. So maybe this case that I'm thinking of isn't too far from the experience of some of our participants today. So imagine that you are a doctoral student, let's say philosophy, because that's my passion. So you're a doctoral student in philosophy, and you're sitting down at your desk to begin day one of writing your dissertation. And you close your eyes and you begin to engage in this exercise of with your imagination. So you imagine what it would be like to put the period on that final sentence of your dissertation. You imagine what it would be like to defend your dissertation, to receive your degree, to be hooded by your mentor, to be called Dr. So-and-so, to get your dream. Imagining this, bringing into the concrete these kind of abstract ideas, brings you a whole lot of joy. Brings you a whole lot of joy. What's interesting here is that by means of your imagination, you conjured up this joy in yourself. And that is directly under the control of your will. You decided to engage in this act of using your imagination. And I think you're directly responsible for these kinds of emotions in you. You conjured them up, and depending on the emotion and depending on the value or object in which to which they're responding, they can be either good or bad. Okay, so those are passions that are directly under our control when they're kind of conjured up. A second type of case of consequent passions or emotions that Aquinas considers are those that are what he calls an overflow from the will, or a sign of the strength of your will. So a totally different type of case. Suppose you have a daughter who's been studying abroad. You love her so deeply. You haven't seen her in several months, and you're at the airport to pick her up. And when you see her arriving in baggage claim, your eyes well up with tears of joy, and you run out to meet her. Those tears, that joy that you are feeling, Aquinas thinks, is a sign of the strength of your love for her. It's an overflow of your will into the passions. And in this case, You would be responsible for this sort of emotion, and it could increase or decrease the goodness of your act, once again, depending on the emotion and the object in which to which it's responding. So in the virtuous human being, the rational powers in us, so that's the intellect and the will, can control the emotions. And maybe control isn't the best word here. Maybe I'd like to use the word harmony instead. So in the virtuous human being, there's a harmonious relationship between the rational powers and the movements of the sensory appetite or the emotions. That is, our rational powers can tell us whether such and such a thing is an appropriate thing to feel an emotion about. Is it the right time to feel the emotion? Is it the right amount? Are we giving an object its proper or due response? The intellect can decide that, can judge that. And that's the life of virtue for Aquinas, for Aristotle, when the higher part of you, that is the intellect and the will, are putting the right order into the emotions, when they're in harmony with the emotions. Again, not because the emotions are bad in themselves. I mean, they can be very, very good. One final thought about the emotions. So far I've been talking about how, reason and will can exercise some control over the emotions, how reason and will need to corral them or bring them into harmony. But the thing is, the harmonious relationship between the rational powers and the emotions is actually a two-way street. Not only do our rational powers judge and shape our emotions, but the rational powers also need the cooperation and the support of the emotions in order to be perfected. So Aquinas would say that a person who just does the good thing in spite of contrary emotions, maybe just doing something out of sheer duty, that person is merely a continent person, not yet a virtuous person. Maybe, for example, we can think of a teenager who's obedient to his father and taking the garbage out. He does it grumbling all the way. He does it, okay? So he's doing the right action, but he's irritated about it. So we might say, okay, well, this teenager's emotions are not yet in harmony with his reason. And what does this all mean? Well, I think one thing for sure is that we should actually cultivate our emotions through formation. And we've been talking a lot about formation over some of the panels that we've had. We can cultivate or form our emotions so that we can support the intellect and the will through our emotions. Think of how much easier it is to do a difficult thing when you have the support of the emotions. So, if we're giving a presentation in front of 100 people, isn't it easier to do it when we have confidence and not fear? Isn't it easier to avoid certain sins like gluttony if we have an aversion toward overeating, to having that second or third piece of cake, rather than if we're doing something by sheer willpower? It's easier to do it if our emotions are on board. C.S. Lewis makes a similar point in The Four Loves, and he just has this wonderful line that really struck me as true. He says, "The highest does not stand without the lowest. The highest does not stand without the lowest." The highest in this case being the intellect and will. Once again, why? Because we share this in common with God and the angels and not with other animals. The lowest being the sensory appetite, which we share in common with lower creatures, other animals. So what he's saying is the right disposition of the lower power, the sensory appetite, is necessary to perfect, to fully actualize the rational powers, those higher powers. So I think we can safely say then that for Aquinas, the emotions are absolutely necessary for the moral life. They're necessary for human happiness, for human perfection. Thanks. Turn it over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Beth. Okay, so I want to bring in some of the things that Hildebrand says into the conversation here. And I want to highlight what Beth said to start this presentation, namely that the goal here is to get at the truth of the matter about these things. Aquinas, Hildebrand, whatever other authorities we invoke here are important, but they're only important insofar as they help us better understand our own lives, and here in particular, our own moral lives. Let me also start, again, where Beth started, with this question of what do we mean by the moral life? And I want to go back to something that I talked about a few days ago. Hildebrand calls our attention to these different motivations. And a few days ago, I mentioned 3 motivations that he talks about. He talks about how we can be motivated by what's merely subjectively satisfying to us. He talked about how we can be motivated by things that are objectively good for us, that is, that genuinely perfect us. And he talked about how we can be motivated by values. And values are those things that are important in themselves, those things which call for a response categorically. That is, they call for a response not just in the sense that we ought to respond to them so that we can become happier, or we ought to respond to them so that we can become more perfected, but they demand a response in and of themselves. When I see an unjust situation, when I see someone, say, being belittled or harmed when they ought not be, I ought to respond. It demands that I intervene. It demands that I say something. It maybe even demands that I put myself in danger in order to protect this person from unjust aggression. Again, regardless of whether that's going to be good for me. Now, Hildebrand does think that when I respond to values, it is good for me. It does perfect me. But the key distinction he wants to draw is a distinction in what my motivation is. Am I motivated by the situation's goodness for me? Is the thing I'm pursuing my own perfection, my own happiness, my own flourishing? Or is the thing that I'm consciously pursuing responding to this value, responding to this, this importance in itself because it deserves a response? And Hildebrand thinks that in order for us to be moral, that is, in order for us to live up to the responsibility of being a free person, I think that's the core of morality for him, living up to the responsibility of being a free person. In order for me to do that, I have to transcend myself. That is, I have to go beyond myself, beyond my own desire for perfection, for happiness, for flourishing, and be motivated by the value, the importance in itself of the things that I encounter. Now, I don't want to get into the question of whether this idea is there in Aquinas and Aristotle or not. Father Brent touched on that earlier. That's been touched on a number of times. What I want to focus on is this phenomenon that Hildebrand is calling our attention to. When I encounter values, when I encounter the injustice of someone being belittled, when I encounter the goodness and holiness of a saint, which calls for reverence, which calls for emulation, when I encounter the beauty of an artwork, which calls for awe and wonder, I ought to give it that response because it deserves it, because it calls for it. So let's just keep that in mind. Hildebrand wants us to keep our eyes firmly fixed on that idea of value when we're thinking about morality. And Hildebrand then wants to distinguish different sorts of responses that different kinds of values call for. And he carves up these responses according to those 3 powers that he thinks are there in our souls, in our spirits: intellect, will, and the heart. And keep in mind also that when he's talking about the heart in this sense of the power of the soul, he's talking about those spiritual affections. He's talking about those feelings that we have, which, as we've heard, Aquinas locates in the will, but these feelings that we can have that are intrinsically meaningful. They're not merely motions of the sensory appetite. They're not merely bodily motions. Rather, they are meaningful meaningful, intelligible, even rational responses that have this felt character, this emotional character. Things like adoration, wonder, awe, desire for God, or negatively, things like spite or repugnance, these sorts of meaningful responses that we might have to what is disvaluable. Okay, so we've got these three different kinds of responses. So some values, some sorts of importance in themselves, call for a theoretical, an intellectual response. When I encounter the truths of Christianity, they call for belief. Once I've really understood them, I ought to respond by taking up this stance of the intellect, where I don't just sort of consider them dispassionately. Rather, I assent to them. My intellect has a movement towards them of adhering to them. I believe the truths of, say, the creed. Other values call for a volitional response. That is, they call for me willing to perform a certain action. When I encounter a person being belittled, when I encounter a person being harmed unjustly, I ought to respond, once I've seen that value, once I've seen the call of justice in that case, I ought to respond with an action, right? I ought to will to intervene. But then finally, and this is most important for our purposes here, Hildebrand thinks that certain values call for an affective response. They call for a response of our feelings. And here's a place where I think perhaps he adds to what Beth said is in Aquinas. Perhaps he just highlights, though, something particularly important there. He certainly does that, though. I think he's calling our attention to an element of the moral life where the feelings play an absolutely central role. In certain cases, what's called for is that I have a certain feeling, one of these meaningful spiritual affects in relation to the situation. So go back to that case. Suppose I encounter someone being belittled, someone who is, say, in a relatively lower, lesser position of power, and they're being belittled by someone who's in a higher position of power, so it's a clearly unjust situation. I ought to will to respond. I ought to do something here, intervene, tell the person to stop it, protect the person who's being belittled. But I also ought to feel a sort of indignation. If I fail to have that feeling, the feeling that this is an unjust situation, the feeling of perhaps even a holy anger in the face of this situation, if I don't have those feelings, I have not responded adequately to the situation. I have not responded as a full person to that situation. In short, I have not given the value of justice which presents itself to me in this situation. I haven't given it its due. There's a meaningful, intelligible response between the feeling of holy indignation or holy anger and the call of justice in that particular situation. So Hildebrand here thinks that it's not merely that the feelings provide a necessary motivation for acting well in that situation. It's not just that they make things easier in that situation. It's not just that I'm responsible for cultivating the feeling such that I have the right kind of feeling in that situation. Rather, the feeling itself has a moral character. The feeling itself is what is due, what ought to be there, what justice demands in that situation. So Hildebrand really wants to call our attention to this idea that cultivation of the emotions is of primary importance in the moral life. Primary importance for giving reality what is due to it. I ought to feel love for my wife. I ought to feel the feelings that go along with courage, that sort of invigorating feeling when a situation calls for courage, and so on. We go through all sorts of other moral cases. Feelings are called for in these cases. And again, this goes back to Hildebrand's view as to what it is to be a person. To be a person is to be the sort of being who transcends him or herself, who goes beyond him or herself and makes contact with objective reality. And we do that through thinking, we do that through willing, but we also do that through feeling. Now, what I've been talking about so far are particular responses of the affections, but Hildebrand also thinks that when we think about virtues, when we think about these states of the person where we are disposed to act well, feeling also plays a really crucial role there. And here I want to bring in a technical term from Hildebrand. It's a term that's come up in a number of the talks so far, but I'm not sure that it's been defined yet. It's what he calls a superactual value response. So what's a superactual value response? Well, again, maybe it's most helpful to understand this by distinguishing it from a number of other cases. What I've been talking about so far are actual value responses. Right? I see my wife and I feel love for her, and that's due to her insofar as she is my wife. And I see the person being belittled and I feel indignation and I feel invigorated such that I want to intervene, such that courage, the feelings of courage rise up in me. These are what we might call actual value responses, particular individual instances of value response. A superactual value response, by contrast, is a sort of ongoing value response. It's a sort of background to the way in which I look at the world. It's not necessarily something in the forefront of my mind. It's not something that I'm always directly conscious of. Rather, it's a sort of underlying feeling that colors all of my response, all of my actual responses towards the world. So, for example, if I have a basically hopeful stance towards life, I might not always be feeling the feelings that go along with hope, but my whole stance towards the world, the whole tenor of the way I approach life is a hopeful way of approaching life. Or suppose I have a sort of general disposition to love all persons. Again, I might not be actively thinking about that. I might not even be directly feeling that love in a particularly conscious way at all times, but a sort of loving attitude is going to inform all of my responses, all of my actions towards the world. I could also have negative superactual value responses. Suppose I'm generally a jaded person. I approach everything cynically. There's going to be a sort of emotional tenor to my whole life that's cynical, that's jaded. And I'm going to be disposed then to perform actions like mocking things, belittling things, downplaying the importance of things, and so forth. Hildebrand wants to emphasize that these superactual value responses, these sorts of emotional tenors to our whole life, are a crucial part of the moral life. And they're not just a crucial part of the moral life insofar as they dispose us to perform certain actions, or insofar as they make certain actions easier or harder, but they're important in and of themselves. It's the double stance that a person takes towards life in the emotional tonality, the emotional quality of their life, is a key feature of the moral life, a key feature of being a person who is relating to the world in a responsible sort of way. And Hildebrand notes that the sort of general tenor that a person has, the sort of superactual emotional value response that they take towards the world, you can see it in a person's life. You can see it in the features of a person's face, right? You can often note when a person is a generally hopeful person, or a generally jaded person, or a generally indifferent person. You can see it in the way that they carry themselves in their actions. You can hear it in the tone of their voice. So it makes a crucial difference in and of itself, and not just in particular actions with respect to our moral life. One last point about, perhaps two last points, about the role of the emotions in the moral life on Hildebrand's view. Hildebrand emphasizes the importance of being what he calls morally conscious. And this is an idea that goes back really far in the moral tradition. We find the same idea in Aristotle. Aristotle talks about the morally serious person. the spoudios in Greek. And the Christian tradition, the Christian spiritual tradition, has talked about the person who is morally or spiritually awakened or alert. This is the person who attends to each and every aspect of their life in such a way that they take their responsibility for action seriously. And Hildebrand contrasts the person who is disposed to do good actions, who is virtuous in a certain sense, right, in the sense that they always want to do what is good, but is not yet morally serious. And they're not yet morally serious precisely because they don't have this super-actual value response, where they have a general tenor of reverence, of love, of openness to values. Those sorts of feelings are not coloring their whole life. They might have particular virtues. They might be a just person. They might be a courageous person, but there's still something missing, a sort of emotional seriousness about moral responsibility. So there's a sense then for Hildebrand in which feelings, spiritual affections, provide a sort of bedrock for the whole moral life. And then finally, last point I want to make, and this is a point that perhaps has been mentioned a number of times, it's not just at the level of that bedrock, and it's not just at the level of particular feelings that the emotions play a crucial role in the moral life, but it's also, once we've reached perfection, once we have reached fulfillment, flourishing, once we're the best people that we can be, feelings play an absolutely crucial role there. The end goal is enjoyment. The end goal of human life, happiness. And happiness, Hildebrand wants to emphasize, is in large part a feeling. Yes, it involves perfecting all of our powers. Yes, it involves being in the best intellectual and volitional state, but it has to involve that feeling as well. We wouldn't call someone happy who was indifferent to the world, or who was purely objective in a sort of logical or robotic sense. Rather, human flourishing is emotional flourishing. So both at the foundations of the moral life, in our particular moral responses to the world, and then in the end of the moral life, emotions play a crucial role for Hildebrand. Thanks. And now let's go to questions.
John Henry, can I ask Mark a question first?
Please, yes. Okay.
So Mark, I'm really intrigued by this spiritual value, super actual value response. And yeah. I'm wondering, when does a person have one of these sort of overall or overarching attitudes or dispositions toward the world? When do you think a person becomes set in that way? And then do you think a person can change? So if I'm jaded now, might I become a hopeful person?
Yeah, I think so. So I mean, I see no reason to think that people can't convert, and that conversion can't involve a change in one's general emotional tonality. I mean, I think it's hard. I think this is something Aristotle doesn't use that word, super actual value response. But it's something that Aristotle pays a lot of attention to, how hard it is once you're vicious to change, how hard it is once your emotions are set to change. And I think you can see this in a lot of conversions. So sometimes people undergo moral or spiritual conversions such that they come to have a new set of beliefs, right? Say they were an atheist previously and now they're a Christian. But the super actual value responses they had, the jadedness or the cynicism or whatever, that often carries through. And I think that's why Hildebrand's distinction between these sort of different kinds of virtue, like having virtue, mere virtue versus this morally serious virtue, is important. So yes, it can happen. It's hard for it to happen. How does it happen? I imagine it could happen in a number of different ways. So through habituation, through forcing yourself to suppress certain feelings, right? Like I notice, okay, speaking personally, I tend to be a kind of cynical person. I notice I'm cynical. When I'm having cynical responses, like don't voice those. Try to shut those down a little bit, and maybe that will help me have a better super actual value response. I think it can also happen all at once sometimes. That is, it doesn't always require habituation. Sometimes something happens that melts one's heart, right? The tradition talks about, the melting of the heart in love, whether it's through an encounter with a particularly holy person, or through an encounter with a beautiful liturgy, a beautiful artwork, whatever it might be. Maybe it's a situation where you were absolutely called to take responsibility for someone in a way that you weren't previously. I think there are cases I've seen in which people changed their whole emotional tenor in those cases. How do you know you got it? I mean, I guess it's just sort of in the general feel of your life.
Do children have it? I mean, do you think your children have super actual value responses? Are they just hopeful kind of when they come into the world?
I wouldn't say all of my children have been particularly hopeful when they seem to have different sorts of sort of general temperaments. Maybe relating it to that idea of temperament, of a sort of natural inborn disposition, and then your super actual value response develops out of that. That might be a way of thinking about it.
Thanks, Mark.
So we have, as you can imagine, a whole bunch of questions here. And again, there are some common themes here to them. So I'm just going to see how many we can get in. So let me begin with one, which I think is probably directed to you, Mark, but it's not a question about von Hildebrand or Aquinas per se. So Beth, you could please comment on it as well. So I'm just going to read it. So someone writes here, I can see how the emotions have moral character. They are involved in the perfection of our being. I'm having a difficult time understanding the moral responsibility in the case of not being angry when someone is belittled. How can someone be responsible for not feeling something? I can see how they would be responsible for recognizing that they were not angry in the face of injustice and not self-examining and aiming towards self-correction, but this emotion of anger is still not voluntary.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So I think this has come up in maybe most of the panels so far. These feelings have what a lot of the presenters, what Hildebrand calls a gift character. That is, they're not under my direct control in that my choices and actions are. I can't just look at injustice and sort of gin up some anger, right? Sort of muster that up somehow. Rather, it has to come about, again, through a sort of habituation. That is through, in those situations, reflecting afterwards on the fact that I wasn't angry, and reflecting on why that situation merits anger, and perhaps trying to sanction the little bits of anger that were there once I recognize that that is the right motivating emotion and the right response, the due response, that situation. Here, I think there's an important distinction. Suppose I encounter the situation of a person being belittled and I did nothing to intervene. Clearly, I did something wrong for which I can be held responsible. And that was something that was under my direct control. Suppose I did but I felt no anger. Seems like I'm responsible and I did something wrong in a completely different sense. That is, it would be weird for other people to hold me responsible and say, you did something wrong there. I didn't do anything wrong. I did the right thing. I intervened. I just didn't do it as a whole person. I didn't do it in my full capacity as a person. So in a sense, that's something I have to hold myself responsible for, and seek to change through habituation and reflection, and so forth. So I don't think Hildebrand is saying we ought to blame people when they don't feel the right thing. Rather, we ought to, again, cultivate and educate our own emotions, so that we can respond in our full capacity as persons, so that we can receive those gifts of the emotions in the situation.
Thank you. Beth, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think that Mark, what you're saying is exactly in line with what I was presenting regarding Aquinas's view. Someone who does the right thing but doesn't. The emotions are just not on board, and you think that there's something wrong about that. Yeah. So I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are a number of questions here that bring in the reality of grace. So, for example, one person asks whether grace given in the Christian life in general, but also, for example, in the sacrament of confession, isn't something that needs to be taken significantly into account in the cultivation of these emotions, or even in the ability to receive them, the grace to receive them. That's not explicitly worked out in Von Hildebrand, but presumably more in the Thomistic account. Beth, would you agree?
Right. So is the question, I guess I'm not quite understanding. So,
well, one person asked, would confession not help towards permitting a kind of deeper change of the sort that we were saying is difficult to in the life of virtue?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, I'm not a theologian, so I feel like I'm, going out on shaky ground a little bit here. But, since I am a Catholic, there's something, I know something about this. But, when we go to confession, we do receive special graces that pertain to the particular sins we're dealing with to help us overcome those sins that we're dealing with. And so I think, when we're in a state of grace, supposing that after confession we are in a state of grace, what that means is we have the Holy Spirit dwelling within us. We have all of the supernatural virtues in us. We also have the gifts and fruits of the Holy Spirit. And so when we're talking about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, we can directly be moved by God to have his disposition toward some object. So we might have certain wisdom or counsel with regard to some state of affairs that we wouldn't have otherwise had, which is God's disposition, God's wisdom, God's counsel toward something. And we also have emotions because of the fruits of the Holy Spirit. So we have spiritual joy. We have a certain kind of love, which resonates with God himself when we're in a state of grace, which I think we have after going to confession. And then once again, particular graces to deal with those sins, which I think can help us stamp out the vices and get our emotions on board. I mean, because that grace is perfective and elevates our whole being. And so I think, well, for sure, it's not just bolstering the will, but I think it would enhance our sensory appetite as well.
There are quite a number of questions here expressing some concern over the lack of being able to feel the emotions. So I'll just read a couple of these comments and then you all can comment here. So one person says, what would Von Hildebrand say, and I suppose we could say also St. Thomas say, is the main cause of our indifference to responding to values that one would say are evident? Would it be due to a lack of our appreciation of the values, or a lack of the use of our imagination, as Newman might say? And then a more psychological comment is made by someone who says, as a psychologist, I would note that the numbing of emotional states is a common problem and a learned state that is in need of repair. It is a defensive shutting down to protect the self from a feeling that might be overwhelming in a moment and then generalizes. Healing is needed in this, and this often needs to be assisted by another outside of oneself. So you get the idea here. There might be moral reasons or other reasons in a person's life that they cannot seem to feel the emotional life fully. It's somehow repressed, or there might even be these deeper emotional and psychological issues. Any comments you might have on that? I'm sure our viewers would be grateful for them. It's quite a theme here in the question box.
Yeah, so the first part of the question, what are the causes of indifference to values? Or I might even put it positively, what might be some of the causes of sensitivity to certain values? And I think the causes are multiple and varied. So certainly our given temperament, as Mark mentioned earlier, the life experience that we have, which includes our upbringing, our education. I mean, what did our parents expose us to? We talked about exposure in one of the other panels. Have we been exposed to beautiful works of art? Have we only been exposed to cartoons or something? That would affect our sensitivity. And then to the psychologist's point, I really like that comment, because I also think the woundedness of our life can affect our sensitivity or lack of sensitivity to certain values. It affects how we respond to certain things. And as the psychologist put it right, I think that we can be healed from that. And to Mark's point earlier about the superactual value responses, it seems that, let's suppose because of woundedness, we do have a cynical or jaded attitude toward the world. I think that can be, through grace, through the help of psychologists, counselors, that can be healed and transformed such that we take on a different superactual value response.
Yeah, and even outside of, say, a professional or clerical setting, I mean, the friends you surround yourself with, your spouse, your children, whoever you're spending time with, this is going to have a huge impact on your superactual value response, on your stance towards the world. I'd also want to emphasize, I mean, we spend a lot of time here talking about sort of the spiritual side of the person, but there's a bodily component to these things as well. I mean, we are soul body unities and not just souls. So this point that Beth is emphasizing from Aquinas about the sensory appetites seems really important here. Although we can rightly distinguish between spiritual and sensory appetites, there's a lot of intertwining between these two. Rarely do you get one without the other. And so various chemical balances and imbalances in the brain, the things you eat, the amount of sleep you get, things like this, these can have a huge impact on your superactual value response. This comes out really well in the work of another personalist philosopher, Edith Stein, who talks about things like how sleepy you are affects your general tonality towards the world, and your physical health affects your general tonality towards the world. And so I think we should not underestimate those influences even on the very highest aspects of our moral life.
Yes, all very good comments, Beth and Mark, and I'm struggling here in the question box with the many fine questions that are coming in, and again, to our viewers, we will be gathering all of these questions and trying to bring them to all of the faculty in a way so we can return to them. Here's one maybe final question before we end the session. And again, I apologize to those of you who've submitted so many excellent questions. But here's a very Hildebrandian question, and I'll just read it for you. So this is a question for either of you, and the person writing says, partly inspired by a moment in literature. In Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky vindicates his hero, Alyosha, for feeling an excessive emotion over the death and disrepute of his beloved spiritual director. He writes, in some cases, it really is more creditable to be carried away by an emotion, however unreasonable, which springs from a great love, than to be unmoved. It seems that Hildebrand would perhaps agree with this when he speaks of a higher form of being out of one's mind, a legitimate moment in one's life where one loses the solid ground under one's feet and no longer clearly oversees the situation. Yet for Hildebrand, this ecstasy or divine madness is specifically rooted in a supernatural gift. Do you think that we should allow for such moments either in an explicitly supernatural or natural form in our moral lives? And could we reconcile them with St. Thomas's ethics? So here's someone who is going to bat for the emotions in their most intense and ecstatic dimension. So either please comment on that observation as it is a question.
Sure. So yes, I agree. Yes, I think that these things are important in our moral life, and not just in our moral lives, but in human life in general, depending on how wide a net you want to cast with that term moral life. I mean, these things are important in our aesthetic lives. They're important in our intellectual lives. These sort of ecstatic moments, yes, in which there's sort of, like in Plato's term, there a divine madness comes upon us. I think that this is my own reading of Aquinas. So when Beth talked about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Holy Spirit are a sort of divine madness in Aquinas. That is, when I act through a gift of the Holy Spirit, through wisdom or through understanding, I am acting not through my own power, but through God's power. I am sort of caught up to share in divine activity. And I think that maybe provides a model for this sort of higher madness, so to speak, where I'm not acting in virtue of my own abilities. I'm acting in virtue of an ability that comes from outside me. And I think there are graced examples of that. And there might also be natural examples of that, where I'm sort of caught up in the activity of the things around me. When I stand on the edge of the Yosemite Valley or the Grand Canyon or one of these places, I'm sort of caught up in the value activities, so to speak, of the things around me. They draw me out of myself and give me a way of acting that I wouldn't have had on my own. So yeah, I think on both Aquinas and Hildebrand's philosophies, there's a clear way in which this happens, and it seems really important for the moral life. Beth, I don't know if that's your reading of Aquinas.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm just thinking about the case of a great spiritual leader. I think about some of the holy men and women that I know, and it seems that a great deal of sadness would be the appropriate sort of response to the death of a holy person. At the same time, though, I think Aquinas could also say, at the level of a spiritual affection, we can simultaneously experience great joy. So also knowing that, well, maybe knowing is too strong of a word, trusting that person is now seeing the Lord face to face for the first time. So having a joy and a trust in that, while also being extremely sad for ourselves for the lack of face-to-face friendship that we once enjoyed with that person. So I think, yeah, I mean, if that spiritual friend that you had was so holy, the appropriate response would be a great deal of sadness, this excess of sadness that the question writer mentioned.
Yes. Yeah, I think if I could just say one more thing, John Henry. So that point about the sort of excess of sadness and excess of joy, if we look at Aquinas' exploration of Christ's emotions on the cross, I think we can see here a sort of blueprint for the sheer range of emotional life available to human beings, because Christ on the cross simultaneously feels, in at least a certain sense, the greatest sorrow any human being has ever felt, and at the same time he has the beatific vision, right? And so has the supreme joy that any human being can feel. Professor Seifert a few days ago talked about how the affective sphere is a sort of an ocean of emotions. It's not just a single river going in one direction. So I think these sorts of cases show how even in their most intense forms, we can have lots of emotions, rightly responding to the world in a whole range of ways.
Well, we could obviously carry on. The questions continue to come in. Thank you all very much for your remarks and for your answers. We'll take a very quick break here, and then we'll resume with our next session on the theme of empathy and human compassion. So don't go away, and we'll be right back with you. Thanks so much.